we're talking about the Articles of Confederation government, and we said that if we could sum that up in one word, it would be weak, very weak, because it had no power to tax. It had, it could raise an army, but it couldn't really pay for it. They had no power to regulate commerce, and the Articles of Confederation was deliberately made to be weak. Why? Yeah, people were fearful of a strong central authority. They were right in the middle of the American Revolution when they created this. Who were they fighting? What kind of government did they have? Does that have a strong central authority? Do you think that our founding fathers that made the Articles of Confederation were fearful of, instead of having one tyrant 3,000 miles away, we'd have 3,000 tyrants 1 mile away? Yeah, he was very fearful of having a strong central authority. So they intentionally created it to be weak. But it wasn't all bad. They did come up with some land laws about how to organize the Northwest Territory, and then providing things like public schools and freedom of religion in that territory and the prohibition of slavery. So those things were all good. But there was definitely going to be some problems, some serious issues that were brought to the forefront of people's minds that showed just how troublesome the Northwest Ordinance is going to be. And one of those instances is called Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion happens in 1786. It is pretty alarming uprising that takes place in Massachusetts. Okay, now just because the Articles of Confederation government doesn't have the power to tax, who does have the power to tax? That's right, the state governments still have the authority to tax, and they do, because each of the states have a pretty high war debt. In particularly Massachusetts, where was there any fighting going on there? Yeah, lots of fighting took place in Massachusetts, and so it cost them a lot of money. And the way in which they're going to recuperate that money is by taxation. Well, if you are an impoverished backcountry farmer, and the way in which you live is you grow the food that you need, and then you trade, if you have a surplus of food, you trade it for things that you need, and that's how you survived. You don't really handle a lot of money, a lot of currency. But when the tax man comes to your door and says it's time for you to pay your taxes, and you say, well, I have some corn or I have some whiskey, they say, sorry, we only take money. And what happens when you don't pay your taxes on your property? They can take your property away. It's called a foreclosure on your mortgage. So a lot of these poor backcountry farmers in Massachusetts were losing their farms due to mortgage foreclosures and taxes. And it's sad because a lot of these guys are veterans. They're veterans of the American Revolution. And once these impoverished farmers and their families begin to lose their homes and lose their farms, they're upset by it. And about 4,000 of them, led by Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays, rise up against the perceived economic injustices. So Daniel Shays and his followers, which are called Shaysites, wonder if I started an uprising, what would my followers be called? Morons. I like that. We'll go morons. You probably would be a moron to follow me, right? Okay, but the Shaysites, they're not like Americans today. They don't go get their machine guns out of their closet and go fight. They don't have a lot of weapons. Okay, they're poor farmers, so they have to get some. Ooh, where do you get them? Where are you going to get them? Who has the weapons? The federal government has weapons arsenals all over America, left over from the American Revolution. So Daniel Shays and his Shayites storm a weapons arsenal, an armory. We used to have an armory. You ever heard of the armory in Beckley? It's not called the armory anymore, but there used to be weapons in there. But Daniel Shays and his Shayites attempt to capture a weapons armory in Springfield. So now you have trained, battle-hardened veterans who are armed and are willing to use violence to get their way. So they need to be stopped. They need to be stopped. They're using violence to influence government. So how do we stop them? How do we stop them? Okay, we're going to call in the army. So the governor of Massachusetts gets on his figurative phone. There was no phones. But they contact the federal government, the Articles of Confederation. So you guys need to send the army here immediately because I have 4,000 armed veterans willing to use violence to get their way. And they're marching here right now. And the Articles of Confederation government replies and says, we don't have an army. We have no money. None of the states gave us any money to raise an army. Sorry, you're going to need to call up your state militia. Well, the governor of Massachusetts can't do that. Why? Who's the state militia? These guys that are the rebels are the state militia. The former veterans. They're the ones that would put themselves down, I guess. So it's kind of a bad situation. How does this come to an end? It's so weird. It's like a good old boy way it ends. It's like they call George Washington, and George Washington comes and stops it. They're like, hey, George, we need your help. And George Washington, at his own expense, hires some soldiers that he knew from the Revolution. They go to Massachusetts, and they stop the rebellion. So what? Big deal. Just some poor farmers. Why is this so important?
Shows how weak the Articles of Confederation.
That's right. And because of its extreme weakness, it shows that we need a what? A much stronger government. So you could make the argument that Shays' Rebellion fundamentally alters the course of American history. It also, kind of highlights the struggle between rich and poor in our country. So, after the events of the rebellion, a meeting is called for to take place in Philadelphia, and it begins in May of 1787. Now, what's the purpose of this meeting? We're going to try to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation because it's obviously bad. Okay, it's not working. We're going to try to make some changes to that weak Articles of Confederation. Well, according to the Articles of Confederation, how do you change it?
There has to be
13 out of 13. It has to be unanimous. Well, Rhode Island doesn't even show up to the meeting. Can we change it? No, it's impossible to change it. So that meeting, which initially was intended to make some changes to the Articles of Confederation, ends up becoming the Constitutional Convention. It would be like me saying, okay, guys, after school today, we're going to have a meeting in here, and we're going to change our seating arrangement, and I just want to get some input from you guys. And then so we meet, and so instead of making a change to the seating arrangement, we like begin remodeling the school, like knocking walls down, rebuilding stuff. That would be the equivalent of what they're doing here, okay? And that's what exactly, like, people, imagine you're an American citizen and you're like, okay, my delegates are going to Philadelphia, they're going to make some changes. And then a couple months later, you hear, like, okay, that government we had, we threw it in the garbage, but we made something totally new, you're going to love it. That's how it went down. And that's what happened at the Constitutional Convention, okay? Now, a lot of issues had to be addressed by the Constitutional Convention, but I just want to tell you a little bit about the people involved here. Okay, first you have a representative from the state of New York named Alexander Hamilton. You guys know anything about Alexander Hamilton? He's one of our founding fathers. The convention nearly died at the very beginning, but he's a brilliant guy, like him or not. Some people don't like him, some people love him. But he brilliantly saved the convention from complete failure. And, but, just through his own charismatic way of handling things, making everybody feel included. Every state chose representatives to send except for Rhode Island, very independent-minded Rhode Island. There were 55 men in attendance, 55 from 12 states. And it begins on May the 25th, 1787. That's when it technically begins. Every session they had was held in complete secrecy. Every session was held in complete secrecy, with armed guards posted at the doors and the windows closed so that no one could see or hear what was going on inside. So our government starts out with, secrecy. So it's kind of don't be surprised when you hear about the government doing bad things in secret, because it started that way. Why would they do that? Why would they post armed guards and shut the windows and lock themselves into a room in the middle of July with no air ventilation, wearing wool suits? They didn't want anybody to hear what they were saying, because they didn't want the people outside that room to know their opinions, because they thought they might be upset with them. They didn't want their constituents to know how the things that they were saying. All right. So, but we have, I mentioned Alexander Hamilton. George Washington is in attendance. Benjamin Franklin, a very old Benjamin Franklin. James Madison plays a very extremely important role at the Constitutional Convention. In fact, he's known as the father of the Constitution, James Madison. Mentioned Alexander Hamilton. But what about Thomas Jefferson? Was he there? He was not there. What about John Adams? Not there. John Hancock? Sam Adams? Patrick Henry? None of those guys were there. Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Thomas Paine were in Europe, basically begging for money, asking for more loans from France. Sam Adams and John Hancock were not selected by Massachusetts. Like, they were not chosen by their people to represent them. And Patrick Henry just declined. He's just like, I'm not going. So it's a long way to Pennsylvania. So amongst these 55 guys were pretty conservative in their role. They're all white men. There's no women there, no people of color. Majority of them were well-to-do lawyers, merchants, shippers, land speculators, moneylenders, wealthy folk, for the most part. Not a single person of these 55, was poor, okay, or in severe debt. 19 of the 55 were slave owners. 19 of the 55 owned slaves. And aside from like Benjamin Franklin and George Washington, it was a pretty young group of men. The prevailing thinking amongst the majority of these men is that they were nationalists. They realized that having strong state governments and a weak federal government was failing and had failed. Shays' Rebellion definitely pointed that out. And so they wanted to preserve and create a young republic with democracy, with a stronger federal government. That's what nationalism's all about. And they had great pride in doing it, a great amount of pride. So they believed in having this republic. Okay, so once they get there and they reach Philadelphia and they realize they can't change the Articles of Confederation legally, they just decide they're just going to scrap it instead of revise it. So the Articles of Confederation was a unicameral body. What does that mean? Unicameral. Camera with one lens. Camel with one hump. Cameral is like house. It's a one-house legislature. And that's all they had. Like we have the Senate and House of Representatives. We have bicameral legislature. The Articles only had one house. Each state got one vote. So there's only 13 people in the entire government. So what's a problem with each state having only one vote? What's an issue with that? That's right. Smaller states would have just as much power as larger states. It would make West Virginia equal in power and authority as, say, California. Is that fair? It's equal, but it's not fair. I mean, California has probably 55 times the population of West Virginia, honestly. So they should probably, in all essence, in all theory, and equal, to be fair, shouldn't they have 55 times the power? Well, small states don't like that argument, but larger states do. What was the largest state in the United States in 1787 in population? Virginia. And so they liked it. They wanted it to be represented by what metric? What did they want to use to determine representation? How much power each state would have? Population. They wanted to be based on population. Like, hey, Rhode Island, you're tiny and you didn't even show up anyways. Heck with Rhode Island, we want it to be based on population. Other states that are small and tiny, like, say, New Jersey, believe it or not, had a very small population at that time. They wanted it to be based on, equal representation, regardless of size. Doesn't matter. I'm a state, you're a state, and that's all that matters. So each side had a pretty good argument, because one's based on fairness, the other one's based on equality. I think we can all agree that fairness and equality are both good things, right? So what do you do when you have two sides who are, want something, but each of them are completely different? You have to come up with a compromise. Who could tell me the definition of the word compromise? Just your own words. Definition of compromise. Have you ever had to make a compromise in your own life?
It's like whenever you have to give up something in order to get something.
You give up something in order to get something. And both sides have to do it. So this is what the small states and the big states compromise on. It's actually referred to now as the Great Compromise. Virginia had their plan, the Virginia plan, which was for large states such as Virginia, New York. And then there's the small state plan, also known as the New Jersey plan. And what the Great Compromise does is instead of being a one-house legislature, we're going to create a bicameral or two-house legislature. One of those houses, the representation in it will be based upon population. The other one will be based on equality. Which one is based on population? That's right, the Virginia plan is. Which House of Congress that is established by this is based on population?
The one other than House of Representatives.
The House of Representatives. How many members does the state of West Virginia have in the House of Representatives? If it's based on population, there's 435 total. How many does West Virginia have? 3. How many does California have? 53. Why? Why are the numbers so different? It's based on population. How do we know the population? The census. How often do we do that? In years that end in what number? 0. Did you guys know we just had a census year? Do you know why we have a census? Did you guys know West Virginia's number might go from 3 to 2? If we lose population and the other states gain? The census is not something done for fun. It's in the Constitution. And the purpose of it is to determine the apportionment of representatives in the House. Okay? So the bigger the state, its population, the more representation they get in the House. Okay? Some states have 1. Okay? We have 3 currently. And it's that number, that official count of the population is done every 10 years. And it began in 1790. All right. What about the other side? What about the other house? What's the other house called? Get the House of Representatives and the Senate. How many members are there in the United States Senate? How many from West Virginia? 2. Very good. How many does California have? 2. Why does everybody only have 2? Because it's based on equality. Every state has the same. So you have the Senate, which utilizes the New Jersey plan, or the small state plan, based on equality. And you have the House of Representatives, based upon the population. And if you want to make a law, do both sides have to agree? Yes, it's pretty tough. There's some, the House of Representatives has some authority that the Senate does not have. Any kind of bill, a bill is a proposed law. Any kind of bill that has to do with taxes has to start in the House. The Senate cannot create tax bills. It has to start in the House because, taxes are paid by people, and states that have more people should have more say in it. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So that's one just an example of one compromise that our Constitution has. And really, our entire government and way of life is a compromise. Starting with the Great Compromise, um, you know, it's just a whole big bundle of compromises. The next one is one that's really referred to as the original sin of the United States of America. And that's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. You ever heard of it? Okay, so it is kind of what it sounds like. It has to do with the Great Compromise, where we're going to count the population. Do slaves count? Well, that's what this is about, okay? How does the South feel about counting slaves in the population? They should count. Why? That's right. And it's going to make their population higher, right? Do they even consider slaves people in the South? No. Do they want them counted as people? Yes. What does the North say about counting slaves as population? No. They're not. The North literally says they're not people. They are your property. And so therefore they should not count. And so they compromise. And they say, for every slave, they will be counted as 3/5 of a human being in terms of population. This is literally built into our Constitution, that people are not worth a full person. This has obviously since been stricken out of the Constitution with the 13th Amendment. But that's what the Three-Fifths Compromise does. Many people at the Constitutional Convention wanted to completely and entirely outlaw slavery forever. A good majority of them, actually. But why didn't they? Why didn't even? It's not even addressed. Other than this, it's not even talked about in the Constitution. Why not? You think those 19 slaveholding delegates would have just walked out the door if they tried to abolish slavery in 1790, right there, or 1787? Probably. And they didn't want another war, and they really just wanted everybody to come together and have one United States country. They didn't want to have two countries to start off with, because that's probably what would have happened right then. Instead, they waited about another 100 years, and then we'll start shooting each other over it, which is what happens. Okay, so the Three-Fifths Compromise, definitely not one of our better moments in American history, but that's kind of typical for Americans. All right, now that they're making all these compromises, who's in charge of all this stuff? Who's running the meetings? Who's in charge of it? Who do they choose someone amongst themselves to be the president of the Constitutional Convention? Who do they choose? It's always the tallest guy in the room. You said who? George Washington. That's what I thought you said. Okay, George Washington. He was very tall for 1700 standards. Probably tall for today too. Yeah, but he was chosen to be. He's a very commanding figure. Chosen to be. He's probably the most famous man in America at that point. It's George Washington. Like, he was famous then, just like he's famous today. I mean, when they're having trouble, when the state's having trouble with their citizens, who they call? They call George Washington. Okay, so pretty important guy. So they create this government, based upon democracy, and they're going to incorporate things like checks and balances and limited government, and it's basically an experiment. Nothing like this had ever been tried before. Nothing. Yeah, the Greeks and the Romans had democracy, but that was a direct democracy. This is a republican democracy, as in we choose representatives to make decisions for us. Okay? We don't vote every day. We vote once a year, and those people we vote for make the decisions for us. And if we don't like the things that they're doing, we vote for somebody else. That's the right of revolution. You just kind of change the government as you feel like. So now we got our government. It's all set up. Now we got to try to get it approved by the states, and that approval by the states is called ratification. And we'll talk about ratification next time. You guys have any questions? You talkative group?